by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crain, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy. Good morning, Dr. Crain.
Good morning, Professor Davenport.
How are you doing today?
I'm making it. I'm learning that being north of 40 is not super great. I'd give it 2 out of 5 stars. Would not recommend. Seems like bits of me just break down these days, but I'll make it.
I can understand completely. I'm very excited. We have a guest that we both have read a couple of his books and are very excited to have Dr. Sam Perry from the University of Oklahoma with us today. We're going to be talking about a couple of his books and have, I think, a really, really interesting conversation. So why don't you tell a little bit about Dr. Perry, our guest?
Yeah, just briefly, Samuel Perry is a professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. He's the author of dozens of scholarly articles. By the way, yes, Dr. Perry, I looked at your CV, and I mean, that thing is a CVS receipt. That was so long, I couldn't believe it. Dozens of scholarly articles and books, including the two we're interested in today, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which he co-authored with Andrew Whitehead, and then The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, which he co-authored with Phillip Gorski. Dr. Perry, welcome to Curiosity Porn.
Hey, it's a privilege to be here. Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into talking about the material in the two books specifically, just I'd like to know a little bit. I always am curious when I talk to other folks in academia. How did you get into this line of work? What prompted you, number one, to think, hey, this is where I want to be? And number two, what was it about the field of sociology that attracted you?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I came from an interracial family. I grew up in an evangelical household with adopted sisters who were African American. And I think, so dating back as long as I can remember, we were having conversations as a family about race, racial identity, and the various kind of dynamics that we experienced as a family. And I think that gave me something of like you might call it a proto-sociological like sense for issues of racial prejudice and inequality and why our family was unique in some ways and what made them unique and the experiences that my sisters were encountering. So I got to college and I was interested in religion. I was interested in race. I was interested in all these questions. And sociology was really one of these subjects that I backed into. Like most people back into sociology, very few people go to college thinking I'm going to become a sociologist one day. Even my own kids don't think that. So you know, I got into sociology though in college, and I just said this is the discipline that is asking the kinds of questions that I've always been asking. It wasn't until though after seminary. So I went to seminary after college to be a pastor, and halfway through I realized I was far more into research and writing. I maybe not into. I was more cut out by gifting to get into research and writing than I was pastoring, and so I was really fortunate to get into the University of Chicago eventually to do my PhD, and that's where I've been. And incidentally, I studied the very things that got me interested. For my dissertation, I worked on evangelicals and adoption and issues of race and related to that. And since then, I've moved on to my research interests, but that's what got me involved. Yeah.
I think that background, coming from an evangelical background, I do the same. And so much of some, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, here in a little bit, but some of the description you did in your book, detailing going to some services, kind of some patriotic, I was like, man, that is straight out of my childhood. I really, really identified with those things. So, and I think it's interesting that experience seemed to inform kind of what you were interested in researching and what you wanted to know about the world. So that's pretty interesting right there, how our life experiences often guide us to what we want to investigate more about as we move through life. So
that was really creepy because I did not know James wanted to ask you about that until literally this morning. And you almost just gave my biography as well, minus the sisters. Like, went to seminary, tried to do the pastor route, completely was terrible at it, went for academia. Do you mind me asking what specific tradition you grew up in, denominationally?
Sure. Just kind of general evangelical. I mean, I think we grew up bouncing around a lot of different churches. My dad went to Dallas Seminary, so we grew up going to Bible churches in Texas. And I ended up going to Dallas Seminary as well. Though I in college, I was in a PCA Presbyterian.
I knew it.
Church.
I knew it. Okay.
And so I'm very familiar with Reformed background. I would consider myself, even today, I mean, like I talk about growing up in evangelical. I'm still in evangelical spaces, so I don't mean to act like I'm somehow walked away from a lot of that. I think I'm pretty far afield politically from where most evangelicals end up being. But as far as my community and the people, my family, my friends are still very much in that space. And so I would consider myself, still more familiar with the Reformed tradition, though I've been in Baptist churches and Presbyterian churches all over.
I told James that had to be true because in your book, of course, I didn't know if it was you or if it was one of your co-authors, but you name dropped Cornelius Van Til, and I'm like, oh, you got to be deep in the niche to know who that is.
Oh, that would be me. Yeah,
I was never a Reformed guy, but there was a time where I was reading all those presuppositionalist stuff and got into some of that stuff.
That's right.
Well, all right, you want to?
Yeah. So you want me to jump off?
Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the two books that we're exploring today deal with this concept of Christian nationalism. And so I think what we'd like you to do first is just tell us how you define Christian nationalism and what got you interested in researching that specific topic.
Sure. So first I'll just add thanks for pressing me to define it, because I think it's really important that we, as the very label itself becomes more popular, and when I say popular, I just mean like popular in use, not like Christian nationalism is statistically becoming more popular. But I think as the concept itself takes off and people are using it more often, it loses its meaning and becomes it can become everything from something that people are claiming as an identity, which we're seeing, to a slur that people use to just slam down conservative Christians getting involved in politics. We've never intended it to be that. We've always tried to define it carefully whenever we can. So in our books, we really define it in a couple of different ways, and that's not to be evasive. We try to use the term to describe in our books an ideology that in Taking America Back for God, we call it an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. And in The Flag and the Cross, we nuance that a little bit, and we talk about Christian nationalism as both a deep story about America's past and a vision for its future. And I think those two ideas are capturing the same thing. But I would explain that as Christian nationalism, Christian nationalism can be talked about in at least three different registers. What I've just described is really the ideology of Christian nationalism, but Christian nationalism can be an identity. We're seeing more and more people call themselves Christian nationalists, like Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about how I'm a proud Christian nationalist. She sold T-shirts about being a proud Christian nationalist and said the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalism. And we see a movement among the Christian right to really claim that label. People are writing books talking about why you should be a Christian nationalist. So it's an ideology, it's an identity, but it's also, I think, as Trump demonstrated, it's a political strategy as well to try to appeal to both audiences, those who identify with the term, but also those who embrace the ideology. And it doesn't require that you believe any of that. Like I don't know if Trump believes anything at all other than just kind of whatever means success to him or winning. But he's able to use that kind of rhetoric to appeal to that audience. So it's also a political strategy in that right.
That interests me, and we're going to have a whole bunch of conversations, I'm sure, today, but it just your two books were the first two that I've read that actually try to give some description to this moniker Christian nationalism. And what does it mean? What do people who believe in this way, what do they think? What do they want to accomplish? And so I thought it was very clarifying for me to go through that. I'm wondering, though, as often happens, some of this people coming out now saying, yes, we are Christian. Do you feel like, wait a second, that's not, I wasn't trying to promote this necessarily. Or do you feel like that in some way people have taken this moniker and just ran with it without actually exploring it a little bit more deeply?
Sure. I mean, I think what we are seeing, the people who are embracing the label, that has really been more of like a basket of deplorables kind of move. You remember from the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton calls, Trump followers a basket of deplorables, and they embrace it and they kind of like start to mobilize around it. Like, wow, we're the deplorables. And I think that is the intent of the group of people that, like, from Marjorie Taylor Greene to the other people on the Christian right who are writing books, they actually are saying this. They're saying, like, if they're going to criticize us for embracing what we feel like are what they would feel like is standard Protestant political thought in their view, we should just embrace the label and then somehow take the power out of it. though that, in my opinion, is not a good strategy, because I think the people who are embracing the label are really the exact. If I were a person, and I would consider myself somebody who is not only a scholar of this topic, but somebody who is deeply concerned about it, both as a Christian myself, but also somebody who values liberal democracy and thinks that's important. I think Christian nationalism is super problematic, and I am in fact glad for the people who are embracing the identity, because they happen to be people who embrace the very things that we would describe as like the negative correlates of this kind of thing. So, for example, the people who are writing books about like why Christians should be Christian nationalists, these people will commonly tweet things on social media about why the 19th Amendment should be revoked. That's the amendment that gave women the right to vote, or why interracial marriage is sinful, or they will say blatantly anti-Semitic things, right? Like I could not script it better as somebody who is concerned about the ideology that the people who would identify with it are the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, and not people that are living lives of kind of Christian integrity and winsomeness, right? Like I think it's so all that to say, we didn't intend for people to embrace the label, though. I would say I am. If I tell a white supremacist that what he's doing is white supremacy, and he says, because you said that, I'm going to do white supremacy even harder now. I've got to take that and understand that it's like, well, you can embrace that if you would like, but I still feel like I'll have to call that out for what it is.
Sure.
So between the two books that you've written, you mentioned the survey items that you used from the Baylor surveys to measure levels of Christian nationalism. I noticed, though, that the items differ between the two books. Could you talk about what the survey items are and why you went with two different lists between the books?
Yeah, so between the first and the second book, we really just added a question. It was a question about the founding documents. We wanted to add a little bit more nuance to that second one, just to get a little bit about the deep story, what we were talking about in that second book. This connection about the second question was, well, let me go with the first ones, and then I'll talk about what we added. The first ones was a series of questions that we did not come up with. This was found data. This is Paul Froyce, who was at Baylor, started asking questions like this in the mid-aughts. So in 2005, 2007, we, for various reasons, replicated those in the 2017 survey, and I'll talk about why in a second. But those questions had to do with we asked Americans to indicate their level of agreement with statements like the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, the federal government should advocate Christian values, they should enforce a separation of church and state. We reverse code that so that we're looking at people who disagree with that statement. They don't want a separation of church and state. A question about prayer in public schools and religious symbols in public spaces, and God's plan, America being tied with God's plan, or America's success being part of God's plan. And so in the second book, we added a question about whether somebody felt the founding documents like the Declaration and the Constitution were divinely inspired. And so what we do is we try to capture Christian nationalism not as an either or category. We don't like going around. I don't like call people Christian nationalists. I think that's kind of ugly. And I think that's a conversation stopper. What I try to do is I try to emphasize that this is an ideology that people can exist on a spectrum, all the way from people who strongly reject it, all the way to people who are what we call the true believers. And so we wanted to add a question that asked about whether people thought the founding documents were divinely inspired, to get a sense of like how they felt like America and Christianity were historically connected. But honestly, since then, we have since changed the survey items again to try to capture what we feel like is just a more direct indicator of Christian nationalism for various reasons. So let me say we didn't come up with the original questions, even though I think they work. I think we've seen so many studies that have come out, peer-reviewed studies again and again, and I review them every month and I see them published every month. They use the same measures and they come up with the very same results. And so I'm confident that those measures are just fine. But we wanted to be a little bit more explicit. So now I ask questions. We have a series of questions that we ask on our surveys that we just distributed the last few months that ask Americans how much they agree with statements like being a Christian is an important aspect of being truly American, or that the nation's laws should be founded upon the Bible, or that Christians have an obligation to take dominion over America's educational, media, and cultural institutions, those kinds of things. So we want to get really explicit so that people don't have any mistake about like what we're implying by these questions. But that's a part of science. So like I love having these questions about measurement because, we are always, as social scientists, we're always trying to get at what are the better ways to measure the various constructs that we think exist out there. And so we're trying to capture those things. We're trying to get like, okay, what percentage of Americans really affirm those kinds of measures? How can we see this going across surveys? How can we see it change? And even though some measures might be imperfect, we make choices about what to repeat so that we can see continuity over time, like we did with the Baylor religion surveys. So in 2017, we asked those same questions. And we knew that like, hey, maybe some of those questions we would like to retire. But that wasn't because they were necessarily bad questions, it's because we thought we could ask better ones.
Now, between in the two books, you make the case that Christian nationalism is something really completely different from religiosity, and saying that they differ in important ways. Can you kind of unpack that? What is the difference between what people might think of when they first hear that phrase Christian nationalism, and then what might be going on differing there from what someone might see as a adherence to a true Christian faith in some way, shape, or form?
Right, sure. So let me. That has been a part of our kind of research that we've had to clarify again and again, because I think people like me who I am not somebody who is like left my Christian faith or left my church or deconstructed, whatever that means, in any kind of significant way. I feel like I actually grew up with really good models of what church life was like. I had good parents who were evangelicals in the best sense of that word. So whatever I write is not is not a reaction to some kind of embitterment that I feel about like the church or some kind of I've never been burned by any kind of faith community or that kind of thing. In other words, I've seen religious commitment that does not look like Christian nationalism, and I know that those two things can be different things. Even though, and I will say this, oftentimes we see religiosity, how often somebody prays, reads their sacred scriptures, attends church. We often see that as positively associated with Christian nationalism, because the people who are in church a lot and are hearing those kinds of messages are often the people who are embracing Christian national ideology. That's unfortunate, but the two things are not the same. And I'll talk about how they're different. One example of how they're different is religious commitment, as we measure it, often is powerfully correlated with how people behave in their moral life. So if somebody goes to church, prays a lot, reads their sacred scriptures, often we find that they're behaving as a family member, or in some ways that they're less likely to say, look at pornography. They're less likely to get a divorce, that kind of thing. Interestingly enough, though, Christian nationalism is not correlated with those things. Christian nationalism is more about a vision for how society should be structured, and it usually means in ways that privilege one group over the other group. So it's hierarchies, it's boundaries, it's order. But when we look at, say, whether or not Christian nationalism predicts whether or not somebody looks at porn, it does not. It's not statistically associated, or whether or not somebody gets a divorce themselves. It's not. Somebody who subscribes to Christian nationalism no more or less likely their marriages are no more happy. They're in other words, their actual practice in life is not any different as a result of embracing Christian nationalism. That's why it's more of a political ideology. It's more of a vision for how society should be ordered. Whereas religious commitment, I think, changes people's lives in really meaningful ways. It doesn't necessarily sometimes it makes you more pro-social, as we talk about in our book, Taking America Back for God. Oftentimes we find that religious commitment seems to make you a more pro-social person, to make you the kind of neighbor that people would want to have around. Christian nationalism, I don't think anybody would confuse it with making people the kind of neighbor that they would want to have around, embracing the kinds of views that we see it associated with. So I think there's pretty important distinctions between religious commitment and Christian nationalism in that regard.
You write that Christian nationalists, on the tail of that, they aren't as interested in piety as they are in power. Could you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think Christian nationalism is ultimately about winners and losers, and it's about power and authority and order. And so it really isn't about, this is why Christian nationalism, we found in our first kind of big study on this, the one that really, I think, put this topic on the map before the books came out. We found just after the 2016 election, we collected survey data, like really a couple of months after the 2016 election, and we asked Americans why they voted for Trump, or we asked various questions. And we asked, we had a question about vote, and we found that Christian nationalism, along with like Islamophobia, was basically, those were the 1 and 2 strongest ideological predictors that you would vote for Donald Trump. And it was not being an evangelical Christian. It wasn't how religious you were. It was Christian nationalism. So so the very fact that Christian nationalism is so powerfully connected to a leader like Trump, with all of his shortcomings and all of the things that he's said and done, I think it's a pretty good indicator that it really isn't about personal piety at all. It's about allegiance to the group, right? It's about winners and losers. It's about power. And we have found that again and again. In our second book, The Flag and the Cross, or my second book on Christian nationalism, The Flag and the Cross, we find that Christian nationalism is strongly associated with support for various ways of kind of controlling problem populations by authoritarian means, right? So torture, capital punishment, any means necessary, policing, basically the use of violence when necessary, righteous violence, because that's what it's ultimately about. It's about controlling society in a way that you can make sure that that certain values are represented, your values, your culture, and your authority are protected in that way. It's not about how often somebody prays or whether or not people love Jesus at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's so interesting you say that. I mean, can you just say a bit more about that? Because you draw interesting connections between Christian nationalism and just violence more broadly, the approval, the use, even guns. Didn't you find some of these things?
Yes, exactly right. So I think, so in a variety of different studies, we find that Christian nationalism, and I'll mention one of the things in the book, we find that Christian nationalism is the leading predictor by a mile that somebody would say the best way to stop bad guys with guns are good guys with guns, right? Like that's the idea of righteous violence. But here's one that didn't make it into the book that we've published subsequently. So with my co-authors and I, we published a peer-reviewed article recently where we just asked Americans in one of our surveys we gave them the Bill of Rights, and we just said, which one is the most important right? So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, Second Amendment, right? Unlawful searches and seizures, states' right, all those kinds of things. And you would think, or freedom of the press, all that. And you would think that the more somebody subscribes to Christian nationalism, the more they would say freedom of religion is the most important right. That wasn't the case. The more somebody subscribes to Christian nationalism, the most important right is gun rights. And the ones that go down, the one that goes down a lot is freedom of the press. freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So freedom of speech and freedom of the press go down as you subscribe to Christian nationalism. Religious freedom, but also gun rights, they go up. And what that means is it's about, it's not about religious liberty. It's not about liberty. It's certainly not freedom of the press. It's certainly not about freedom of speech. It is about, even at the cost of those things, it is about freedom for our group, not yours. And it's about freedom of our group to protect what we think is ours. That's the gun rights part of that. And so that is what we mean. Like, Christian nationalism is ultimately about preserving order and power by violence if necessary. And these are the same kinds of connections historically that I think authors like Christian May have pointed out. Why does Christian nationalism seem to appeal so much to the militantly masculine group, right? Like that feels like, hey, we're tired of getting pushed around by these cultural bullies. We're ready to punch somebody. We're ready to go take the Capitol. Like January 6th is this kind of like emblematic event where you've got people who say, you know what, why don't we just take it? Like, we feel like we're being wronged. We feel like this is something that we're just gonna, the prayer of the QAnon shaman in the Senate chamber is such a indicative kind of collection of statements where he thanks Heavenly Father for filling the chamber with patriots who love Jesus, and that America has been reborn that day, and that with God's help they are stopping all the communists and tyrants and the globalists who are trying to take and ruin the country, and that's what it's about, right? Like, it is about Christian nationalism as an ideology is really about taking back what you feel like is being stolen from you wrongfully, that it is rightfully yours, and they have no right to it, and so you've got to take it back. Which is why I think we titled the second book, right, Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to Democracy, because ultimately that's what it is. Like this group of folks who subscribe to this vision do not value democracy in that way. I'll just give you guys an example. I'm looking at, so as I'm talking to you, I write every day, and I'm always working on different projects. As you mentioned, the CV, this is just something that I do and I love doing. We collected data recently, and we asked Americans whether they would support leaders violating democratic norms during national emergencies in order to take control. And so we asked them whether or not they would support leaders suspending elections in order to take the country through a crisis, or to suppress political opponents who are causing problems in order to lead the country, or to disregard checks and balances, all those kinds of things. And lo and behold, I could turn my computer around and you guys can see it. Like, Christian nationalism is, again, by a mile, the leading predictor that Americans would support somebody violating democratic norms in order to take control and lead our country to safety. And I think that's what I'm talking about. It is an ideology that is troubling as a Christian, because I feel like it twists and distorts what I feel like is a faith of self-sacrifice and generosity, and something that is not embodied in Christian nationalist ideals. But it is troubling as an American, because I feel like it is not about preserving our creedal values of full legal equality and elected representation. It is about establishing a rule that will never be overthrown, and that is the goal of a lot of these folks.
That's so interesting you said that. I was wondering if you had heard or were aware of Russell Moore giving an interview on NPR where he was sort of mourning the fact that he was getting reports from some Baptist ministers about how, like, they can't even just read the Sermon on the Mount aloud in church because, like, they have congregants come up and say, like, oh, those are just liberal talking points. And even when the pastor's like, I'm literally quoting Jesus, they're like, yeah, you can't read that. That's weak stuff. We don't believe
that. Exactly. I mean, I think that's, when Jesus is too woke for your movement, that is a bad sign. And yet this is exactly the kind of, like, Christian nationalism. I mean, I think people I've given a series of, I've given a talk before on kind of like how Christian nationalists use the Bible. And to be honest, it's not a very long talk, because it doesn't need to be. Like, they don't use the Bible a lot, and what they do, it usually ends up being, Jesus clearing the money changers from the temple, because they want to find some kind of reference point in Jesus for being violent to people. And then it's Romans 13, when your side is in power. about like, submitting to the governing authorities and those kinds of things, and maybe some references about bringing a sword and something in Revelation, maybe some prophecy, or it is going to be Old Testament, like we talk about in the flag and the cross. It's going to be Old Testament passages where Israel is commanded to go into Canaan and to start cleaning house, right? Like it's to start, establishing some kind of a law, right? So, are you telling me we can't just mandate God, worship of God? Well, Israel did it. If it was good enough for Israel, why can't we just do that? And these folks, I mean, I'm kind of half joking, but some of these authors are not apologetic about their enthusiasm for, say, like blasphemy laws, for Sabbath laws, for laws that would prevent non-Christians from ever holding public office because they have no right to hold public office in a Christian nation. I mean, they are that explicit about this. I don't think that's where most Christian nationalists are, but the people who are writing books are very much so of that opinion. And so, I mean, it is not something that I think would ever be confused with Christ likeness, and unless you feel like Christ is right now the conquering king who's ready to kick butt and take names and take back a country for his current reign right now.
This reminds me of some conversations I have with my sisters from time to time. As I mentioned, we grew up in what could only be described as a religious right household. At the time, that was the vernacular, right? The religious right. And I very much remember, when the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal occurred and all of these folks in these religious backgrounds, very conservative folks were like, just outraged that the president of the United States would defile the office in that manner, right? And then fast forward to 2016, and you have a candidate for president who basically is bragging about committing sexual assault, who has clearly have been unfaithful to his wives, this kind of thing. And all of a sudden, those very same people who, a few years back were up in arms about this kind of behavior now are working double time, it seems, to justify that, right? And to diminish the significance of it. And it always seemed to me and maybe you can illuminate some of this. It always seemed to me that what was happening here was at least by some of those people who are held up as religious leaders of that in that vein, we're making a conscious choice. We're going to sacrifice the principles of Christianity. We're going to sacrifice our adherence to the teachings of Christ for the pursuit of political power. And that seemed to me like that's what that was a clear decision that many of these folks were making. And whether or not the general public, the people following them, made that conscious thing, kind of thought as well, it seemed clear to me that the so-called religious leaders of that movement at some point in time made that decision.
Right. And I think that's there's I think an unending debate over whether something changed in the Christian right movement, or whether that just revealed what was always there, right? Like whether it was never really about moral values and character. It was just a good, those were just kind of convenient coverings for just our, we want to win. And Trump revealed that was really hollow talk. But we can actually see on surveys that change. PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, they collect survey data. They showed this the best. This two surveys, one in 2011 and one in 2015, when Trump was already surging ahead in the polls, and they asked the same question at two different times, and it was basically like, do you feel like political leaders, even after like moral failings, can still lead the country effectively, or that kind of thing? And of course, in 2011. Evangelicals were the least likely to agree with that statement, and by 2015 or 2016, when they asked that again, they were the most likely to agree with that statement. They've completely flipped that. It was the only change, and it changed by like 40 points, right? Like it was clear that they had said, okay, that's no longer a convenient belief for us to hold. And this is kind of a fascinating thing that we're finding, y'all. Like not to get too much into the weeds with the political science of all this, but it is a consistent finding over the last 20 years that increasingly Americans' religious beliefs and identities are downstream of their political identities and values. And so, like, people, in other words, people are making religious choices on the basis of their politics rather than the other way around. Now, maybe that was always the case, but we're seeing this more and more. Even they're adjusting their theology as a result of what they believe, what they're seeing politically. I'll give you one example. Right before the 2020 election, so before any votes had been counted, we asked Americans whether or not they believe that God chooses the president. God appoints the president. And we found that evangelicals were, of course, the group that was most likely to say, yes, God appoints the president. Fast forward, this is a panel survey. So we asked the same Americans that same question 4 months later after the election, after Biden had been inaugurated. And evangelical Republicans, not evangelical Democrats, but evangelical Republicans dropped in their belief. It's the same group. So these same people changed their opinions about God appointing the president by 20, at least 20 percentage points. So what had happened? Well, it's like their guy had lost. So they're literally changing their theology in light of this political reality. Like, well, it couldn't be that God chooses the president because our guy lost. And so, like, certainly, it's and so that's just kind of a fascinating thing. I think Christian nationalism really is indicative in some ways of this change that we're seeing, where people's politics is now determining what they want to subscribe to religiously in ways that I feel like are really unfortunate and harmful.
Now, I'm really curious, and we're venturing off the questions that Guy spent so much time making sure that that we had. But this just, every time you say something, it just opens up another door. It's like, I got to go open that door and find out. So what I'm really interested in is there, and maybe it's such a small minority of evangelicals that have come to the conclusion, like I did, that wait a second, we've went far afield from what we said we were about. That it doesn't register, that you don't, but I'm really interested. Is there some kind of divide that those evangelicals, and we see some of them, Beth Moore was one that came out and did this, Russell Moore. So some of these folks have said that. Is there a generational divide? Is there an experiential divide? What is it that some of us who grew up, we grew up in these same traditions, right? We're talking about people who grew up as part of that religious right culture. And some of us have said, you guys have went somewhere that doesn't seem to comport with all the teachings that I remember in Sunday school and the preaching that I heard in church services. Number one, is there a significant number of us that have said, slow the train down? And number two, is there anything that you can divide that helps explain that divergence?
I think there's it's difficult to determine which one causes what. I think people who tend to be a little bit more like politically disengaged and politically moderate are more likely to be of the opinion that, like, hey, what I see on the Christian right is really wacky and weird and a distortion of what I feel like real Christianity is. I would like to, and I think there's a cosmopolitan kind of characteristic there. Like, you've got a Russell Moore who has spent time speaking outside of his. Certainly, I would consider Russell Moore a conservative Christian, right? And
sure.
Beth Moore, right? Like, these are people who believe the Bible. They are not. They're people who hold traditional views on probably certainly abortion, same-sex marriage, and those kinds of things. And yet they're more Tim Keller types, right? Like, they're the kind that see their job as Christians to try to translate Christianity to a wider audience, and to them, witness matters, right? And they have hope that, like, by being a good representation, by being a good neighbor, by being a good witness, we can win the world to our view of Christianity being the source, the reason. I would say Christian nationalism is an ideology for people who have given up on that. It is an ideology that I see only take root among people who said, you know what, I actually don't really care about the world anymore, right? Like, they don't deserve what we got. Like, they're too far gone. There's no winning. They hate us and we hate them. And so let's just call this what it is. we're going to have our own schools, we're going to have our own communities, we're going to have our own traditions, and we're going to have our nation because we're going to take it back. And however we need to do that, we're going to put judges in place so they can never vote us out. We're going to try to make it, being a Christian nationalist is the number one, one of the number one predictors that you support making elections more difficult to participate in, right? Like you want to restrict voter access, those kinds of things. Why? Well, because you don't want people to vote. It's Paul Weyrich back from 1980. You don't want people to vote because your leverage in the election goes up as the voting populace goes down. You want people you want to have civics tests and you want to disenfranchise felons. You want to make sure that only the worthy people can participate in this democracy. So, all that to say, to answer your question, I think the Christians that we see embracing Christian nationalism, in my opinion, are the ones that I think have given up on trying to convince anybody with their reputation. They have lost a vision for something that we used to call, growing up in Christian circles, we used to call this witness, right? I want to value my public witness, right? I don't want to be seen in public being a jerk because that is a bad witness. I don't want to be a bad driver. I don't want to go around flipping people off with a Jesus fish on my car because that reflects poorly on Christianity, right? I'm a bad witness. I think people like Bess Moore and Russell Moore and David French and other folks, I think they still recognize that the reputations of Christians matter publicly, and that what Trumpism has done and Christian nationalism has done is basically admitted that we've given up on witness. Let's just fight. And that's, I think, a position for Christians that's a really, really tenuous or dubious position to be in.
Yeah. When you talk about we're going to have our own schools, our own spaces, I want you to expand on that because you found some fascinating things about the relationship between Christian nationalism and race in your survey. By the way, before I let you go on that, are you familiar with Stephen Wolfe, who came out with a book, The Case for Christian Nationalism? Yeah,
absolutely. That was one of the first. So Andrew Torba, who is the founder of the free speech platform CAB, who's a notorious anti-Semite troll, and Stephen Wolfe, who is not a whole lot better. Yes, very familiar with it. Read their books very carefully and have not interacted with them both a lot.
Yeah, I wondered if you just didn't consider Wolfe's book to be exhibit A of everything that you're saying.
Oh, absolutely.
Based on he's arguing for. What was fascinating, though, is you found that there are non-whites who will score highly on this Christian nationalism metric, but they do not share all the other correlates that you found with it, right? You're finding that these correlates are largely a white phenomenon. Is that right?
Yeah, that's why in the last few years we've tried to nuance this and talk about white Christian nationalism more than Christian nationalism, because we find, as we talk about in the book, The Flag and the Cross, we didn't talk about this enough in Taking America Back for God. In our preface to the paperback edition, we nuanced this a little bit more. But in The Flag and the Cross, we wanted to be specific that according to the data, this is not just us trying to make it woke or to make it sound scary. In the data, which we show in The Flag and the Cross, and we've shown in a dozen other studies thus far, is we find that white Americans respond to our questions about Christian nationalism completely differently than Black Americans and often Hispanic Americans as well. For white Americans, talk about Christian values, Christian nation, Christian heritage, and all of those things, it seems to evoke the idea of nostalgia and for a time when the right power, the right people were in charge and the right, kind of values held sway. When Black Americans read those same questions, it does not make them think about an earlier time when the right people were in charge, the right values held sway. They seem to think of it more aspirationally, like Christian nation is the way that Martin Luther King Jr. or Frederick Douglass would talk about a Christian nation, like the ideal that America has never lived up to, that we were always supposed to be but never were. And so we find that they behave so differently. So it really is not fair to talk about Black Americans who subscribe to Christian nationalism. They, it can't be racist, right? Actually, it is very racist. But when Black Americans affirm the same kinds of questions on surveys, they don't seem to have the same idea in mind. And that is because religious questions, religious ideas and identities are racialized, right? You really can't talk about American religion without understanding how it has been affected and influenced by our own racial experiences and history. To talk about Christianity for a white American is to talk about something completely different, experiential from a lot of Black Americans and a lot of Hispanic Americans or historically disadvantaged minority groups for whom religious community has meant something different, for whom religious history has meant something different, and their religious heroes are different in their ideals in some ways. And so, so in our studies, we find that the phenomenon we're describing is something completely different than when, say, a Black American uses the same kind of language to say something that you could see Martin Luther King Jr. talking about with a Christian nation.
In the last few minutes that we have, I want to give you an opportunity to address criticisms that I'm sure you've probably heard. I know I've heard from different areas, mainly one being, from people from a more conservative background. Oh, this is just a way of trying to discredit conservative politics, dressing it up with some academic window dressing, but you're really just attacking and trying to say that if you're conservative, well, then you're a racist, or you're conservative, well, you want to control everybody. I've heard, some people, say, well, if you support the Second Amendment, you might be a Christian nationalist, or if you support free markets, you might be a Christian nationalist, or, and so I want to let you address that and say that's not, I'm assuming that's not what you're saying. As I read your book, that's not the feel that I got. Even if some of those survey questions correlate somewhat more strongly than others, that wasn't the argument you were making. Is that correct?
Yeah, of course. So there are, and I am thankful for people who have written books like Paul Miller. Paul Miller is a great example of somebody who I think Paul Miller wrote a book called The Religion of American Greatness, where he talks about Christian nationalism as well. And Paul and I don't agree on everything, but he is a conservative who is a Southern Baptist, who is an evangelical Christian, who also finds Christian nationalism deeply problematic for a lot of the same reasons. And so I very much appreciate his work. And I think, of course, others like Russell Moore. But we have tried to be very clear that, like, this is not about being a Republican necessarily, even though I think Republicanism is becoming more like the Venn diagram between being a Republican, being somebody who subscribes to Christian nationalism, is moving closer to a circle, right? Like there is greater and greater overlap every year, it seems. But they don't have to be the same thing. Certainly doesn't have to be the same thing as being a conservative. But as you said, oftentimes we find our measures of Christian nationalism are pretty correlated with values that conservatives share. But I would try to point out that, like, look at the things that, and I'm glad you brought up Stephen Wolfe. Look at the things that Stephen Wolfe is advocating in his book, right? Like where he says this is a case for Christian nationalism. Look at the things that he advocates for on Twitter in his book explicitly. He advocates for Sabbath laws, that non-Christians could not hold public office, that he would arrest people for blasphemy, that the leader of the United States should be something like a Christian prince, right? Like that, like some kind of a dictator. Like, I mean, really, like this is the kind of thing that he is describing as like Christian. If you feel like that is conservative, right? Like if that is traditional conservative values, then maybe I do, right? Like maybe if that's what you say is conservatism, then maybe I'm confused and maybe I am actually saying that they're the same thing. But if you would say that that's not real conservatism, then let's just agree that like Christian nationalism is something wholly different. And I'm fine with that. I think where I get bothered is when people say that, like, oh, you're just talking about conservatism, and it's just like, did you just hear what they were advocating for? Like, is that what conservatism means for you? Because I find that really problematic, that you would want to dismantle certain rights that I just feel like are just synonymous with democracy or religious liberty or those kinds of things. And so, yeah, it's not about being a conservative or a Republican. It is about something that I feel like is far, far more reactionary and radical, even. So let me say this, like, Stephen Wolfe is not a conservative in the sense that if I would define conservatism charitably as like the preservation of traditional values and institutions, that is not what he is advocating for. It is something far more radical. He wants to dismantle things and rebuild and reconstruct in a wholly different way. And I think that is more reactionary and radical.
Now you just got me curious. What are the next threads that you're trying to pick up in this research?
A couple of different things. I mean, I think we are we are trying to understand, I'm trying to understand how Christian nationalism corresponds to and shapes American polarization. That's really a project of mine leading up to the 2024 election. I want to, all of my speaking engagements, a lot of the things that I'm writing about have to do with how Christian nationalism amplifies polarization between Americans, and under what circumstances is it most impactful there, and what circumstances. And it usually is like a combination of a variety of different identities, and Christian nationalism being one of those. I'm also trying to understand how Christian nationalism unites Americans in what I call multiracial coalitions of exclusion. So let me explain what I mean by that. I just explained a few minutes ago that we find that Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, when they affirm Christian nationalism, they usually have something completely different in mind, to where their responses on like Second Amendment, voting patterns, racial inequality are completely different as Christian nationalism increases. But that's not always the case. Sometimes when Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and white Americans affirm Christian nationalist measures, they have exactly the same thing in mind. And it usually has to do with things like sexual morality, say like transgender rights or LGBTQ, let's just say LGBTQ kind of beliefs or rights, usually having something to do with family relationships. So in that sense, Christian nationalism is not a divider like it often is on issues of racial questions, but Christian nationalism is a unifier into groups of multi-ethnic, multiracial coalitions of exclusion from certain groups. And so I'm curious, under what circumstances and contexts can Christian nationalism actually serve to unite racial minorities and white Americans against other minorities in ways that I think preserve certain power majorities and certain power groups? And so I think these are all, I mean, I'm nerding out a little bit, but I think these are all questions that I'm fascinated to explore more. And one last one, I'm co-authoring with a group of social psychologists right now, where we're doing experimental designs. And we're trying to understand how Christian nationalism works as a political strategy. So when we find that politicians make reference to the kinds of threats that Christians are experiencing, like Christianity is under threat, it's under siege, they're coming after your Christianity, you're coming after God. What do Americans hear, really? And we find that oftentimes, even without saying anything about race, they often just hear racial threat. When you say Christian threat, Christians are under siege, white people hear white people are under siege, because those identities overlap in really important ways. And so all of these things deserve to be explored more. And so that's where I'm going.
I'm glad you brought up psychology. I'm going to do one more, and then he just gave me a stink eye. One, I just can't let this go. I'm glad you brought up psychology, because I was just curious if any of the survey data included stuff like Big Five personality traits. Reading both of your books, I'm just thinking like, surely these are people that probably correlate with like high need for certainty, high need for closure, those sorts of psychological traits. I just didn't know if you had any of that data or not.
Right. Not a lot of openness to experience on the so we have not included, I think somebody I want to ask this about is Paul Jupe, who's a political scientist at Denison, who is a great survey researcher, a great social scientist. I would reckon in all of the surveys he's done recently with Christian nationalism, I bet he's included Big Five stuff, and I'd be fascinated to see what he comes up with there. I will say we have tried to, when we talked about Christian nationalism initially, people were like, well, aren't you just talking about like right-wing authoritarianism, and have you just account, and we tried our best to include measures for right-wing authoritarianism to make sure that, no, we're talking about something different. And there's social dominance orientation that also corresponds strongly with Christian nationalism. So we have tried to capture Christian nationalism along with various ideological constructs and personality constructs. But the Big Five thing would be a fascinating thing to check out. I would love to see that.
Our guest today has been Dr. Samuel Perry, professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. His two books that we've been discussing, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, co-authored with Andrew Whitehead, and The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, co-authored with Phillip Gorski. Dr. Perry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crain and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.
As we wrap up Possibilities, we'd like to give a special thank you to this episode's sponsor, MidFirst Bank, paving the way for creative expression in our community. Their commitment to our vision allows us to continue to have these conversations. We are grateful for your continued support, MidFirst Bank.